I was speaking to my principal about this, and he said that he actually earned more doing 3 days a week than when he was kind of 5 days a week.
Introducing Dr. Zain Rizvi, who you may see as a familiar face. We first had a conversation during the lockdown. So it's coming up to about 3 years now since we had that first conversation. Actually, a lot of people enjoyed that conversation. I had quite a lot of response from that privately. So no, that was very valuable to everybody that managed to listen to your take on how dental school went at King's as a graduate entry as well. And now I get the chance to catch up with you 3 years on. At that time, you were finishing dental school. You had just written a book. And I think at that time as well, you're working or planning a wedding. I think it was around that same time, yeah. I really want to find out how things progressed from then. But no, thank you, Zain, for coming on today. And thank you for sharing this time with us.
No worries. Pleasure to be here again.
Yeah. So let's get to it. You just graduated from King's. What was on your mind? What were you thinking of? Where was your first job? Yeah, just take us to just after graduation.
Yep. So obviously with graduation, everything happened online. We sat our finals online. We found out we passed dental school online. There was a really long summer as a result of it, because pretty much from March 2020, as we know, until September the 1st, which was actually my first day back in a clinical setting, and that was my first day of work as a DFT in foundation training. You know, that was a lot of months of just not doing any kind of physical dentistry at all. So my first kind of thoughts were like, wow, like, am I going to really be ready to go from fifth year or half, you know, 3/4 of the way through fifth year to day one, my own list of patients? You know, I was used to seeing maybe 1 or 2 patients a day at dental school. And I think on my first day I had, you know, I didn't have loads, but, you know, 5-ish patients with a mixture of kind of, you know, mainly checkups and that sort of thing. But it's quite full on, because you don't really know what to expect. You're going into a new practice, a new clinical setting, new nursing staff, new supervisors. So I think my first thoughts were kind of like, am I going to be up to scratch, or am I going to struggle? And no one really had been in our position, because we were the first cohort to go in having had COVID affect our learning. And also people didn't really know what DFT would look like during COVID. Would we have less patients? The AGP stuff, the PPE, that would slow everything down. So there was a lot of question marks. I think partly as a result of that, and also because maybe I was just missing actual clinical dentistry, I was tuning into kind of webinars every single day of every single week during lockdown. I'm sure we all were, who kind of were around dentistry then. And reflecting on it now, I actually think that just in that kind of cycle of a few months, I think the amount of hours that indirectly and directly I must have logged of information from just all sorts of domains of dentistry, even though I couldn't have practiced it and implemented it straight away. There are just times where, even now, where I'll do something, or I'll implement a technique, and I don't really know where I've learned it from. And someone will usually message me on Instagram and be like, where did you pick that up from? Or when did you come up with that? And I'll be like, no, I definitely didn't come up with it, but I can't quite remember where I saw it. You just retain things that sometimes you see. And I do think a lot of stuff that I do day to day, a lot of that I learned probably over lockdown at some point. A lot of those little tips and tricks that I kind of try and share with people. So that was a lot of COVID for me.
Was the need to go out there and look at webinars because you felt that your final year had been limited? Because that's one of the discussion points within dentistry. Are graduates nowadays coming out with very little experience to be able to take on general dentistry? Or was it because, you know, there was the pandemic and that affected you in a severe way in final year? Just talk to that in terms of, do you feel like your clinical experience was really hampered by the pandemic? Had you managed to get quite a bit of experience, or did the pandemic start and it affected how much clinical experience you got in final year?
I think with COVID, I think we were pretty much towards the end of final year clinical experience when it came. So I don't think I was limited more than I met, maybe a month or so extra than I probably missed out on than I would have had otherwise. I think dental school in general, even pre-pandemic, wasn't really that conducive to a high volumes of repetition, which I think, having done more dentistry now, I think generally your skill set is just related to how often you're doing procedures and how much you repeat them. And so, I think COVID definitely didn't help things, but I don't think it necessarily took away too much from me specifically. I think at that point in 50, I think I was getting to a point where I was really starting to enjoy clinical dentistry, and it was almost kind of like I'd had a few light bulb moments where I kind of wanted to look into certain procedures and certain techniques more, having come across them on clinic or having heard someone speak about them. And so I already had kind of the mindset where I wanted to really find out more information. And I think lockdown kind of coincided with a load of that information being freely available to everyone online, because people were available to teach and to do it for free most of the time online. So it was kind of like the right time, right place, and I was in the right kind of frame of mind. Whereas I know other people kind of almost wanted to get away from dentistry and not have to think about it for a few months, and they were relieved to do so. I was kind of at the other end of the spectrum where I was getting excited to go into practice. I really wanted to learn more, and at the same time, there was more information than there's ever been on the internet. And I think our generation is that kind of generation that does learn a lot through social media and online. So it was kind of like the perfect storm to pick up as much info as possible.
Yeah. And what would you say were some of the big learning points you took from that time?
I think a whole variety of stuff. I think I really didn't kind of narrow my vision or focus down into anything in particular. It was all sorts of stuff, from treatment planning to kind of composites, and even to some stuff which definitely was beyond me at that point, like full mouth rehabilitations and all that sort of thing. I think it was more just like there were some webinars where I probably would pay less attention to just because it went over my head a lot of the time. But I think there were others that I just thought, wow, I need to write this down because this will be really helpful when I start DFT in September. Just stuff like, endodontics, dentures, just general dentistry. And that was really relevant to me going into foundation training, good photography, good isolation, all this sort of stuff that does help you when you start out. And just having the kind of people reiterating that and just going through, it was almost like having a boot camp before DFT without actually meaning to.
Yeah. Did you find that your interests led you to what you wanted to learn more about, or did you have some sort of structure? Were you just looking at everything in general? How did you direct your learning, and how did you make sure that you were actually managing to implement that?
I think it evolved over the summer. I think to begin with, I was just an open book, and it was very random. I was just tuning into everything, and I had this kind of fear of missing out on each webinar, and there were so many going on every day and each time. I think as kind of fatigue set in of lockdown and it being quite repetitive, I think as I got closer to DFT, I kind of started not bothering with things that weren't very applicable to me in the immediate future. So for example, implant stuff, I was a bit like, well, I'm probably not going to touch an implant for at least the best part of the year. So perhaps I can, use my time a bit more efficiently elsewhere instead of tuning into that sort of stuff. But I was always kind of interested in kind of composite work, ceramic and indirect restorations, because I thought those sorts of things, crowns, bridges, fillings, root canals, dentures, I'm going to be doing loads of them in that first year. And it's good to get as many tips as possible so that I can not only discuss them with my supervisors, but also I can start to implement them.
And then, okay, you then started your foundation training. What area were you in? And just tell us, what do you think the foundation year developed in you? Because I talked to final year students who were considering whether they actually want to go ahead and do a foundation year or go straight into private practice. I'm hearing that a lot more and more these days. So I just want to hear from your perspective, what did foundation year do for you? Or maybe it didn't do anything for you. How did you find it?
So I think, just for context, I am someone who, after foundation training, I did go pretty much straight into private practice. So I don't have any kind of bias to basically encourage foundation training, other than I think that it's actually something that I think everyone should be doing from graduation. I think it's a great scheme in general, and I think there's no real environment that replicates it quite the same. I think people have spoken about doing kind of private foundation training years, but it's not going to be, I think that's a long way off at the moment in terms of being as effective and as helpful from a clinical development point of view as the current system of foundation training is. I think a lot of people who maybe think about not doing foundation training probably do so for reasons such as maybe they're not happy with the location that they've been allocated because it's a randomized sort of process, or they've had kind of someone's negative experience. And I mean, to a certain extent, you can be unfortunate and end up with maybe a supervisor or a practice that isn't very supportive, but that's a risk with any position anywhere. Even as an associate, you can always be kind of, you can end up taking a job with the wrong sort of place and wrong sort of people. But I think for what it did for me, I think it's effectively a year of protected time where you're in the setting that you're going to be spending the rest of your kind of career in, which is in a general practice. You're not in a hospital anymore, but you're kind of very protected and you can work in a way, in theory, that is conducive to learning. So you're almost, you've got your patient and you've got the procedure that you're being asked to do on them, but you're kind of being able to ask for help when you need it. You can, my place was great. I was based in Hertfordshire in a town called Hatfield. And my educational supervisor would nurse for me for specific procedures that I felt maybe less confident about, or they thought that I needed to improve. And for example, let's say I had a series of root canals that I was struggling with root canals and I couldn't quite find out why I was struggling. And sometimes you can't always vocalize it to your supervisor if they haven't actually seen the procedure being done, because you don't really know what you don't know. So he'd be like, okay, fine, the next root canal that you have, let me nurse for you and I'll see what you're doing and we can have a chat kind of whilst it's going on. And, like in that process, it meant that I would kind of move from discipline to discipline, getting more confident each one. So, after they nursed for me a few times when it came to endos, I became quite confident when it came to root canal, because I was like, okay, I know where I'm making mistakes. I know, for example, for me, I was like, I know my temptation is to finish too short of the apex. So I should actually prepare a little bit more than I think I am preparing, because I tend to under obturate a little bit. And then, the next thing might be, I'm really struggling with dentures. So, okay, we would do like a wax try-in appointment together, and my ESs would show me, this is what you might be struggling with, or this is a way to solve the problem that you might be having. And the whole year just went like that, which was just like, I'm struggling with something, great, let's nurse for you, or let's help you out. Let's help you understand it and give you enough patience to kind of practice the new technique on. And then it'd be something else. It'd be taking teeth out, and I'd struggle with that. And so I just kind of felt like every kind of weakness that I was having in DFT would just slowly kind of be identified and then addressed, and then we'd move on to the next one. And I think that's exactly how that year should run, which is just that you kind of iron out all those deficiencies in your learning and those gaps in the knowledge that you might have. But it does obviously rely on teamwork, not just you and your clinical staff, but also the supervisors need to be available to help you. And in theory, that is what the scheme is designed to do. Obviously, you always have anecdotes where it didn't go so well or it went exceptionally well, but most people kind of fall somewhere in between.
Yeah, I love that, especially the fact that your supervisor was nursing for you. So that's really being supportive, because they're literally holding your hand throughout the whole process. Was that something you initiated, or did your supervisor offer that?
I think, to be fair to them, they'd been doing that. I remember I spoke to the trainee who was leaving the year that I was joining, because obviously it rotates every year, and she had mentioned that they do nurse with you on occasion. And I think initially I was like, oh gosh, it sounds like they're very picky and almost intense, that they want to watch everything that you're doing. But actually, it couldn't have been further from the truth. It was more kind of like, if you need us, we're here. But also, if you don't need us, then we're in the office, or we're doing, practice admin or whatever. So it was quite kind of, they made it clear that they can always do as much as I need them to do. But also at the end of the day, they didn't want to handhold me too much, because they were looking at 1 year down the line where I'd have to do it all on my own. So they had that perfect balance between like being supportive so that I didn't feel like I was alone and struggling, but also not nannying me too much and spoon feeding me too much, because I remember we came to about kind of March or April time, midway through the year of DFT, and I remember my supervisor sat down with me and he was like, right, you're doing well and you're very comfortable, but we're going to start to speed you up now. So I'm going to start booking you more patients. I want you to cut these procedures down to maybe half an hour as opposed to an hour, so that you just get in the habit of getting a little bit quicker and cutting the time down, but doing it appropriately and safely. Because if he'd started that from day one, I wouldn't have known what to do and how to do it, and I would have been really, really stressed. But after 6 months of me kind of, okay, I've settled in, I've gotten used to the practice. Now let's start to speed you up a little bit, getting ready for life as an NHS associate. And so I just thought it was like a perfectly planned year, and they've been doing it for a long time, as you could probably tell, but I thought it was very well structured. But it did need me to obviously engage with the process, because they'd had DFTs before who just were happy to kind of cruise, and that in it, you can't teach someone to care more about their job. It has to come from them. So I think a bit of both, but they definitely played a massive part in it.
So, I mean, it seems like you had a really supportive supervisor there. I had a question where I was talking to somebody, and basically what they were hinting at was they were asking for help. And I was saying that if I was doing this certain procedure, this is how I would go about doing it. But what I could sense from this dental foundation trainee was that they were trying to not create a big lab bill for their supervisor. So did you ever feel like that was something at the back of your mind, that I might not do certain steps, or I might not provide, let's say, what might be considered a private crown, Emax or zirconia, because I'm watching out for my supervisor's lab bills? Not that that was the case with you, but was it something that was in the back of your mind, and how did you navigate that?
Yeah, it's actually really good that you brought that up, because I'm wary of like kind of over romanticizing my experience, because there were definitely things that were really important to me at the time, and my supervisors were almost the complete opposite end of the spectrum. An example being, obviously, having come from a dental hospital, I was really specific about the materials that I knew how to use, and the ones that I just didn't know how to use. And I was really like, in my first couple of months, I was like, oh, can we order this? Can we order that? And they were like, absolutely not. This isn't a charity. Like, you can use what we've got, and you can learn to use what you've got. And if you want something specifically for yourself, you can ask us. But if we don't think it's valid, you have to order it yourself. I would order it myself, because they were saying no. And I remember thinking, oh, like, why don't they want to support my training? Like, don't they have a budget for me and that sort of thing? And you know what, they might well do, but actually, there's always pros and cons to every practice. And also they had their reasons. And another really good example of something that used to really grate me in foundation training was that I wasn't really permitted to do root canal treatments with rotary endo unless it was a private root canal treatment. I had to do all my NHS endo hand files. And it wasn't so much, they didn't say, oh, it's because of a money thing. They were saying, well, we want you to learn how to hand file before you move on to rotary, which again, I was like, oh, well, that's a convenient argument that you're using. But like, I've always just done rotary at uni. So like, why can't I do it here? And it's like, it makes more sense, more efficient, clinically better, blah, blah, blah. But then I actually did see their point by the end of the year, even though I used to dread every time there's molar endo, I just thought, oh, I'm going to be here for like a week, because it's all hand files. And it was really, my thumb would get bruises by the end of the day, because I'd be just like properly filing. But I completely understood the sequence, and I completely understood every file and why I was using it, and what kind of, I was doing a step back technique, working up the files. And it really did help me from an understanding point of view, so that when I did use rotary for the occasional private case, or when I went after DFT as an associate, rotary was a piece of cake, because I was like, well, this is just doing what all of those series of hand files was doing, but it's just doing it in one file system. And so I kind of have never lost that kind of appreciation of like what I'm actually trying to achieve with the filing system, as opposed to just thinking, this is the rotary endo and it's only pro taper, and I only know how to use pro taper. If you give me wave one, I won't know what's going on. I lost that kind of chip on my shoulder, because I could use any kind of rotary system, because I kind of know what they're all trying to achieve, as long as I just did a bit of reading up on it. So that actually really was something that I think at the time I was really ignorant of. And I was just like, oh, they're just trying to save money and blah, 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 blah. But then now I'm like, actually, they did have a point. And lab fees, it wasn't so much, but it was stuff like, for example, we were only really permitted to do one cobalt chrome case for the whole year on the NHS, because that was the case presentation that we needed to do to sign off on DFT. But they didn't want us doing cobalt chromiums forever, as much as we wanted to do them, because of the lab bill. So there was stuff like that, but it wasn't so cutthroat. It was just kind of like a gentle reminder that, look, this is what we do in this practice, and like that's how we want you guys to adhere by our rules, and these are the reasons why. And that was it really. And yeah, I had to kind of suck it up and go with it. But I think to a certain extent, it didn't matter in the long run. I kind of was better off for it.
Yeah. No, that really helps to clear it up, I'm sure, for people in a similar situation. So yeah, you've told us about you transitioning to that dental foundation training year. Were you worried about whether you'd find your position of choice as an associate? Were you considering DCT? I mean, you took a similar route to me in that you did dentistry as a second degree. So for myself, thinking about DCT and even specializing was out the window because I'd just been in university for too long. So yeah, all of these things and your circumstance, you were looking to get married. I don't know if you were married by then. What was going on around that time, and how did you navigate those next steps?
Yeah, so I remember, similar to yourself, to be honest, I really didn't want to go. Well, it wasn't really a uni environment, but basically I was kind of fed up with a lot of the hospital type environments that we'd just come from at uni, which was just kind of a lot of bureaucracy. I found like in the hospital, even though I really had some interesting cases, there'd be so much barrier to actually doing work dentistry on those clinical cases. It was just like so many people you had to run things by, so many signatures, and then the patients wouldn't be booked in because of some admin error. And it was just, there were so many people involved in the process that I just felt like it was an endless level of bureaucracy. So it kind of did put me off hospital dentistry in general, whether that be specializing or DCT. However, I did have a really keen interest on restorative dentistry. And I thought, oh, you know what, if I could get a restorative DCT, I would probably consider it, because I think the experience that I would get would be quite helpful and I'd really enjoy it. So I did actually put in a DCT application, but solely for restorative for DCT1. So I didn't contemplate any oral surgery positions anywhere. So obviously by the very nature of it, there was only very few restorative positions in London that I was considering. So I put I think it was only 3 or 4 around, and I put them down and I didn't get them. So it kind of made my decision quite easy for me. I knew that long term I wanted to be in practice anyways. In terms of finding a job after DFT, this was a bit like, again, like with COVID, it was a bit of a big question mark where I was like, well, I think I'd worked out by the end of DFT that the kind of dentistry that I really want to do is that the kind of dentistry that allows me to have a lot of time to do a procedure as well as I can possibly do it. And obviously that would come with its associated charges and also the length of time needed to do a really good crown or a really good filling. So it became quite apparent to me that a lot of the kinds of environments that were offering this sort of level of dentistry that I wanted to aspire to do were private environments mostly. But the big kind of conundrum and mismatch was that, well, I'm only a year out of university, and also a lot of principals have this fear that I'm the first kind of COVID cohort that's had their DFT training affected by COVID as well, where they've seen less patients than they normally would, so there's less experience. So I thought, oh gosh, am I going to be like discriminated against based on the fact that of COVID, which obviously isn't anything that's my fault. So I really didn't know who would accept me. I didn't even know if I'd be able to get a good NHS associate job, because I didn't really know what people were worried about when it came to our cohort. So effectively, I just thought, well, I don't know, so I'm just going to have to try and see what lands really. So I did kind of reach out to a lot of people, even through my supervisors, actually, if they knew anyone kind of in Southeast London. I had gotten married at that point, and my wife was working in Southeast London as a doctor, so I knew that I had to be around Southeast London for my next associate position. So yeah, I just started basically cold calling, dropping CVs everywhere around practices that I'd looked up on Google. I didn't really discriminate. It was NHS as well as private practices. I just didn't kind of care who I was sending stuff to, just as long as the practice looked good and somewhere that I thought I could see myself working. I had a lot of people just completely ignore me. I had some people get back to me. Some were just polite and said, sorry, like you've not got enough experience, which is what I was expecting. I had others reach out to me and said, you know, come in for an interview. And I did go to quite a few practices and just visited. And that was also really interesting, because it's weird. Like some of the practices that on paper I thought, oh, this is going to be perfect for me, I went and visited and I thought, gosh, I'm so glad I'm not even considering this anymore. And ones that I thought, oh, should I really apply here? Like it doesn't really seem worthwhile. When I went to see them, I was like, wow, like I actually could see myself working here.
And what were you seeing? What were you seeing that informed you that actually this cultures maybe not
Yeah,
for me, or I could see myself here? What were you looking at?
I think initially in my head, I would look up a practice maybe on Google or whatever pictures were available online, and I would kind of equate like a modern looking surgery to like forward thinking principles, and a good team and like all of the things that you just associate a good environment with. And anything that looks slightly dated, I would think, oh gosh, like these guys are really stuck in their ways and they're going to be really old school and like, more hand filing, that kind of thing. So but that wasn't always the case. Like sometimes some of the most kind of what looked to be quite toxic environments were some of the really, expensive showy ones, and some of the really decent kind of principles. And I always thought I soon realized actually a really good indicator of what a practice is like to work in is how long the staff have been there, including the nurses. And in fact, the clinics that I ended up working at, like my current clinic in Greenwich, a lot of the nurses have been there kind of 20, 25 years. And I'm like, for someone to stay in the same job for 20 years, there must be something good about the environment. Like you don't just stay put for 20 years if it's not comfortable or good in some capacity. You can't put up with that kind of environment for that period of time. So I did always make a note after that to ask like, oh, well, how long have all the staff been here? Are there any new associates or that sort of thing? So it was mainly that. It was kind of demands that principals had for me, kind of expectations, the way that they would talk about other members of their team to me. I thought, for someone there was one principal who, I met for an interview, and it's the first time she's ever met me. And she was like absolutely disparaging the rest of the team, saying the hygienist was a waste of time, this associate was slow. And I was like, wow, like if that's how you're talking about your current staff, like I can only imagine how you might think of me as a new grad who might even need a bit of time and patience as well. So there was a mixture, good and bad. Ultimately, I think deep down, I was really hoping that I'd get some sort of private position, just because I thought, again, perhaps naively, that that's just going to get me to where I want to be in terms of clinically. I thought, as a young grad, if, in private practice, you can have more time and you can charge for your time. So isn't that perfect for someone like me who's a little bit slower? And if I'm given enough time, I can do a procedure really well, but I just need that time. But obviously, you do realize with the passage of time that, again, private practice isn't a charity. They can give you more time, but equally, if a patient's there for the whole morning having a filling done, they're not going to pay £1,000 for a filling. Like you have to be reasonable and realistic at the same time. So, that was a lesson learned almost afterwards. But when you're young and you're kind of thinking about what you want to go into, I was just thinking, private practice. So I was lucky in some regards. I had a practice that, to be honest, I found them on Google, a private practice in Greenwich. I kind of sent a cover letter, CV, and also my clinical portfolio from DFT with all my cases in different categories that I'd done. They hadn't replied to me for months, so I thought they just overlooked me. And then all of a sudden, the principal emailed me back saying, "Are you still looking for a position? I've actually been away on honeymoon, so I actually missed your original email, but we are looking for someone." And I went, had an interview. It was a really nice practice. The interview was really interesting because they were the only employers that actually in the interview didn't talk about money, didn't talk about hours and all that sort of stuff. They got my clinical portfolio up and they started asking me questions about procedures. So they're like, why did you use a Toffel-Meyer band here and not a sectional? Just not aggressively, but just kind of inquisitively, like, what's your rationale for this? Just to kind of see where I was at clinically as a young dentist. And I think I really appreciated that, because that was stuff that I felt like they were taking me seriously, and it wasn't just someone who will fill a gap in a diary. And I felt like they were kind of respecting me as a clinician a little bit by kind of looking at my work and analyzing it. Whereas some of the other places, they were just like, yep, so this is your percentage, these are your hours, do you want it, yes or no? And I was like, I could just be a number, at that point, because it just looked very impersonal. So I took that job, and then I had a few other days in the week that I wanted to fill. So a friend of mine had just recently taken over a couple of NHS practices in Southeast London. So he was kind enough to offer me a couple of days at those practices. So I kind of split my time half and half between a private practice in Greenwich and a mixed practice in Blackheath.
Yeah. Did you find that, or actually, I'd rather phrase it this way, how would you advise other newly qualified dentists to approach interviews? And do you think that there's much in terms of negotiating you can do at each interview?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I do think you're a little bit handicapped from a negotiation point of view, especially when it comes to kind of financials, because you haven't really got any data to go off or to kind of justify asking for a certain percentage. So you're almost kind of, you take what you're given, which is what I did as well. And you kind of gauge it now, having worked for a few years, where you kind of know roughly how much you might be grossing for a private practice. And therefore you can, and then you also know what other people might be grossing in your practice, and also your colleagues who are also at your same sort of stage. And then at least you can kind of position yourself a little bit where you know what a good monthly gross is. And so you can then go to an interview and be like, well, look, I can gross X per month. I think that's quite a good gross for your practice. And so I think I could justify a 45% associate fee. But at that point, you just come off of DFT, you've barely done much private work anyways. And so you kind of, if you are interviewing for just a purely private practice, it's kind of, you're at their mercy a little bit. But also for an NHS practice, it just depends on demand. I feel like when I was applying, it wasn't as much of a demand for associates on the NHS as there is now. So you actually might find a better deal now when applying or interviewing for a mixed practice in terms of UDA rates. I know of people who do kind of like, they'll give you like a down payment of a couple of £1,000 to just so you can get you to sign up on board. So, you know, there's a couple of incentives that people are offering, but then I would also counsel people to think, well, why do they have to offer such a massive incentive if it's a really nice and lovely practice to work in? Surely they shouldn't have. Well, it's not always the case, to be honest. There's a lot of, you know, remote areas in the UK where actually there's just not that many applicants and people who are actually looking for jobs, and that's why they have to try and incentivize people from somewhere that's a bit further away. But in somewhere like London, I think there is generally quite a lot of work to go around. And so, you know, if you've got a nice practice, you shouldn't necessarily have to incentivize people too much to join it. But I think things to really look out for would be, like I said, the staffing. So see how long everyone's been there, try and gauge if there's been quite a high turnover of staff in the last couple of months, because if so, then why is that? Are people unhappy? One thing that I did actually, which I really thought was really useful, was for practices that I was really keen on, I arranged to just shadow their associates for half a day, just to get an idea of what the associate book looks like, and also what the patients are typically like. I know it's only a snapshot in time, but it does give you a good idea of like what life might be like. Yeah. You can kind of see how happy the associate is, what kind of treatments they're doing typically day to day, what the nurse-dentist relationship is like how well supported are they, materials. You get all that information just from shadowing for half a day. It's difficult in an interview scenario where they say, you know, come to the practice during a lunchtime, to then gauge all of these things, because sometimes you just don't have the time to do so. So I'd really recommend, if there's a practice that you're keen on, just arrange some shadowing just for a half a day or so, just to get an idea of what's going on there and whether it's your kind of vibe. But to be honest, sometimes you also don't know. Like sometimes you think it's a really nice practice and then you actually join and it's not so nice. And other times you're a bit, you know, you're writing it off in your head, but actually if you join it and you start working there, you think, oh, it's not actually as bad as I thought it might be. So there's a little bit of trial and error with it as well. I don't think your first job post DFT will be your last job. So that's just something to bear in mind. But I think I always recommend to people just to write down a list of kind of things that are really important to them. And it's not to present to anyone. For me, for example, it was like a good selection of materials, having enough freedom on my diary to book as long as I might need for certain procedures. So that was really important to me. And also having some mentorship available in case I do get into trouble, especially post DFT, to help me out. Let's say an extraction that might be botched and I need some help with that. So those kind of three things were really important to me. And anywhere that I thought wasn't really going to be offering me one of those three things, I kind of didn't really consider. And ones that ticked all those boxes, you know, I shortlisted. So I would just say, select your criteria, because it's different for everyone, and approach practices with that criteria in mind.
I want to move on to your transition into private practice, but before that, one thing I found strange about applying for your first associate position is there's no national recruitment process. There's nobody that comes to you and says, right, it's now May. This is the time to now go and apply for your first associate position. It's not formalized.
Sure.
So how would you help people that are thinking about, okay, when should I actually start um,
Yeah.
going to practices and seeing if I can apply there?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I also was thinking about that during DFT, and I didn't want to start too early, because the thing that people forget is that with national recruitment, there's always a cycle, right? Where you apply, and the people that are going to be taking you on, they also know exactly when they're expecting you, 1st of September the following year. So it's all kind of really prearranged in that sense. Whereas when you go to applying for associate positions, it's usually because someone's left, or because they've built a new surgery, or they've opened a new clinic. And so you've got to ask yourself, well, they're not just going to be leaving an empty room unfilled for months just to wait for you to finish your training. And so it doesn't make much sense to apply from January, even though you might be keen and you want to try and get practice and get things out of the way. Let's say you find something you really like in January, but you don't finish DFT till September. That principal, unless, it's a one-off, one in a million type of person, but they're not going to hold an empty room ready for you for September. They're going to want you to basically apply or be interested about 3 months before you anticipate working there. Maybe a little bit beforehand, they can maybe allow for that. But yeah, typically the notice period in most clinics is 3 months. So if an associate leaves, they have about 3 months to wrap things up, and then that room is free. So I think May, June, July, I don't think it's leaving it too late. I think that's probably an ideal sort of time to, if you want to really get started early, May is probably a good time to start kind of going to some interviews, just to get in the habit of like what you want to look for, get a feel for kind of what's out there in your area. But you can't really stall too long. If you really like a place, you kind of have to accept the offer, and you also have to let them know when you can start. So there's no real point in trying to secure a position early doors, if you have to make the principal wait 6 months, because they're not going to do it. So yeah, that I think May is a perfect time to start to kind of look into these things.
Yeah, 100% agree with everything you said there. Spot on. And my first associate position was because the practice was expanding. So there was a new surgery being built, and it just lined up with me finishing foundation training. So that's how it worked out for me. So yeah, unless someone is leaving, a new space has just opened up, there's got to be a reason why that's
for sure.
Okay, let's talk about this transition into.
Sure.
You've been working as a foundation dentist. You've had an NHS post as an associate. How does this transition to private works? It seems to be very mystical. People think, do I need to have done certain courses and then I can go private? What proves that someone can go private? Just take it from there.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one. I think, to put it into context, the main problem for young dentists wanting to become private dentists early doors, the biggest thing that counts against them is their lack of experience. And that's understandable. Principals, like I said, they care about their patients. They want work to a certain clinical standard. The only way I've been able to circumvent that, despite having graduated 2020 on my CV,